This is Bloomberg Equality. I'm Caroline Hyde.
And I'm Romaine Bostick. This month, we've broadened our coverage of markets and the economy to take an all-inclusive look at what social equity and equality truly mean for companies, for investors, and ultimately for our collective global prosperity. We've dug deep into several key topics. That includes the corporate retreat from DEI, as well as the nuance of protecting rights across the globe. But today, we're going to turn our attention to the United States with the 2024 election in focus.
Sitting President Joe Biden, former President Donald Trump preparing to go toe-to-toe tonight in the first presidential debate taking place in the key battleground state of Georgia. Now, the matchup is set to offer voters insight into the policy priorities of the two candidates who remain divided on a number of issues. One of those priorities, reproductive rights. Earlier today, the U.S. Supreme Court announced a decision allowing emergency abortions to take place in Idaho for the time being, a decision that was inadvertently posted online yesterday. Now, over the next 30 minutes, we will discuss the range of hot-button issues, from the economy to immigration, that tie directly to societal inequities and remain top of mind for voters, for businesses and beyond. But look, let's start with the Supreme Court ruling, Romaine.
Yeah, a very timely ruling setting up ahead of tonight's debate here, a ruling on that Idaho abortion decision, and it really highlights what you're seeing on the chart behind me. The fact that reproductive rights abortion has actually become a huge campaign issue. We know for quite some time it's been a huge issue for Republican voters, but we've actually now started to see this become the primary issue for Democratic voters as well as independents as well here. Right now, that's creeping up to more than 50% of the electorate right now, making this, Caroline, a top campaign issue.
Kayleigh Lyons joins us now to discuss what the priorities will be at the debate later today. And Kayleigh, for many it will be women's rights, abortion rights, and it feels as though Trump has started to be more nuanced on the application of this.
Well, Trump has waffled a bit on what his stance on abortion actually is, Caroline. His latest policy that he does seem to be sticking to is that he wants this left to the states, which is exactly what the Dobbs ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade ultimately accomplished, sending this power back to the states. That ruling, of course, happened 2 years ago this past Monday. And since then, we have seen more than a dozen states either enact almost total abortion bans with very few exceptions, and even more still enact 6-week bans in the aftermath. And what we know is in 2023, the first full year since Dobbs fell, 1 in 5 women had to travel out of state to get an abortion because of those restrictive policies in many states. And what data from the Guttmacher Institute suggests is that disproportionately affects low-income women who may not be able to afford that kind of travel. It also, according to the data, affects women of color more greatly, which makes abortion an issue that has the power to exacerbate inequality, be it racial, economic, or gender equality, because, of course, economically, the economic outcomes for women are highly dependent on when they choose to have children. And in fact, data does suggest that in those states with some of the most restrictive abortion policies, they also have some of the largest gender pay gaps. So abortion is certainly one of those social, cultural issues that is going to be at play tonight and in the election. But it also is part of this wider pushback against so-called wokeism, pushback on some of these cultural issues, including LGBTQ plus rights, which we have seen espoused, especially by those in the harder right of the Republican Party. Certainly you're seeing that in states such as Florida, under Governor Ron DeSantis, but you're seeing it congressionally as well, including an entire month last summer that was dedicated to pushback against ESG policies.
Oh, yeah. That's a month that a lot of us will remember for, I don't know, at least the next few weeks, Kayleigh. I am curious, as we head into the debate tonight and we talk about the singular issues, and we know a lot of voters really go to the polls with really one big thing in mind. Reproductive rights has obviously risen to the top of the list for a lot of folks. But talk about the economy, because in the past, we used to always say it was about the economy, stupid, and it feels like it's a factor, but is it the dominant factor that it was in the past?
It still is a dominant factor, very much so, Romaine. In fact, most polls nationally show that voters either rank the economy or immigration and the border as their top issue. And it's especially an issue that affects minorities as well, and those at the lower end of the income spectrum, especially considering the bout of inflation we have seen under the Biden administration, with prices up about 20% since he took office. You could look at the words of the chairman of the Federal Reserve himself, who has said that you see the burden of high inflation falling heaviest on those who can least afford it, which which does tend to be those lower income households and many minority households. And that may be a reason, according to many pollsters and strategists we speak to, that you are seeing minority voters turning away from President Biden, even though they were a huge part of the coalition that elected him into office in 2020. Just last night, new national polling from the New York Times and Siena College found that 26% of black likely voters are indicating they would support Trump. Back in 2020, that number was only 5%. So you're seeing this very significant demographic shift potentially toward Donald Trump, away from Joe Biden. And the economy could very much be a reason why. And we expect that among the points Donald Trump plans to hit the hardest against Biden tonight, the economy is going to be at the top of that list.
Kayleigh, what else should we anticipate for today? I mean, obviously it's being run in a different manner, no people in the audience, a mute button. But how divisive, how much a focus on inequality ultimately will be focused on here?
Well, it certainly will be divisive, Caroline. I think the contrast between these two candidates will be quite stark, even if it is a bit more contained and controlled than when we saw these two debate in the last cycle in 2020, given the mute button and the lack of a live audience. But we can expect them to hit their points incredibly hard. There will certainly be a lot of blows dealt. Of course, Joe Biden likely to focus on abortion rights as well as the protection of American democracy, whereas Donald Trump, as I mentioned, likely to focus extensively on the economy and also on the issue of the border. And immigration, when we're having this kind of polarization and equality conversation, is very important. In fact, the University of Southern California has a polarization index in which it found that immigration policy is actually the most polarizing in America right now. And we see that borne out by the complete lack of ability for Congress to do anything in a bipartisan manner to address immigration and border policy, which is why Joe Biden in recent weeks has taken several executive orders aimed to address that. But you have to do that in the executive branch at the moment, which makes what these executives say about that this evening all the more important.
Kayleigh Lyons there. Speaking of polarization, we continue that conversation right now with a look at a 2023 Gallup poll that was highlighting some of those partisan gaps over issues like the ones that we just touched on here and expanded on over the past 2 decades. We had a chance to catch up with Rachel Kleinfeld, senior fellow over at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. They've done a lot of research on this issue of polarization, and their findings, they might surprise you.
Americans are actually not very polarized on policy issues. You get huge agreement in the middle on really hot-button topics like immigration or abortion, gun control, but we're very affectively polarized. That means that we hate each other, and we don't know that we have a lot of similarities in our policy beliefs.
Well, where is that coming from, though? I've heard this argument before that, when we hear about these big culture war issues and it gets amplified and we become so obsessed with it. And I've heard this argument that those opinions represent probably a small fraction of our society, yet they do seem to dominate our headlines, our media, and certainly our social media.
That's exactly right. What we have is a small chattering class, a lot of media, and some political partisans who are very incentivized to push us to become more and more polarized. And those entities sell papers, get eyeballs, get votes by polarizing people more and by telling us that we're more polarized than we are. And so there's real incentive structures working to make Americans think that they disagree more than they do. What that means is that they tend to vote for more extreme candidates than they otherwise would, and that gives the cycle a self-fulfilling quality.
So pull apart those political incentive structures and ultimately whether a different voting system changes that, or is this something that we're seeing no matter how people vote around the world?
Well, what we're seeing actually is that, for instance, in Europe, far-right parties gained in a number of countries in the recent EU elections, but they didn't take over a whole political party. They gained a small vote share that would give them a few more parliamentarians in the EU Parliament, and people had a wide variety of options to pick from if they still wanted a more typical center-right or center-left and et cetera voting. So that ability to pick from different flavors of politician rather than just two means that although people have preferences that are moving, the whole party isn't flipping into a real polarized place. America, by having two major parties and also by having a winner-take-all system, that means you get one extra vote more than your opponent, you get the whole shebang, whether that's a state or a city or a district. Those two structures are found to be very polarizing structures and also lead to more political violence.
So what becomes the solution, if at all, particularly here in the U.S. here? Is there anything that could sort of arrest this progress and even more importantly, I guess, reverse it?
Absolutely. So there's been some great research out of Stanford. They looked at 30,000 Americans. They did all sorts of interventions to see if there were ways to decrease polarization. And a number of them proved really useful. One was just correcting misperceptions, just telling people, hey, guess what? The median Republican and the median Democratic voter actually share a lot of the same policy views. You're being politicized by other forces. Things like that make a big difference. Showing people that Democrats and Republicans can get along to do other things, to build a community garden or to act in interests that they both share, that helps a lot. Helping Americans realize just how bad it can get, what it looks like when other countries fall into dictatorship or political violence, that can help a lot. And then while Stanford didn't test it, we know from these cross-country comparisons that different voting systems help a lot. When Northern Ireland got out of its troubles, its real extreme violence, they switched to a proportional representation system because they knew that it would depolarize their country. And in America, there's a number of groups, usually led by citizens and blocked by professional party politicians, but attempted by citizens to give people just more options to vote for. So Alaska's passed voting reform, Maine's passed voting reform, and it's in the works in Nevada and other places.
Well, that gets to the point of sort of who ends up sort of helping to lead this process. Is it going to be sort of a singular figure, maybe at that federal level, or is this going to have to be much more organic from the individual communities, cities, and states?
So people who win in the current process are unlikely to want to change that process. That's just the incumbent reality. And so it tends to come from citizens, although some members of government, of course, are more open to it than others. And in cities and states that have citizen referenda, where people can put things on the ballot themselves, you're seeing a real desire to move towards systems in which people can vote for, say, a socially conservative Republican over a fiscally conservative Republican, or vice versa, or a Democrat who supports the working class and is more class-based versus a Democrat who's more socially and racially aware. And so you're starting to see a desire for, can we really express our actual feelings? And by the way, can we be enfranchised if we're part of the minority in our state that's still pretty large? California, for instance, is a Democratic state, has a huge Republican Party, numbers-wise, that's disenfranchised. And you see the same thing in major Republican states that have large Democratic groups. And those people don't end up getting to share what they really feel and don't end up feeling represented when you get the ideology of extremes taking over the candidates, so they don't represent the whole of the state. So you see a lot of citizen desire for this change.
What about corporate desire? How are companies weighing in or trying not to at this moment?
Trying not to might be the main thing that they're trying to do. Companies really would rather do business and stay out of politics. Polarization is not good for business. It makes it hard for them to keep their staff happy. They get demands from both sides, and whoever they please, they know they'll displease the other side.
Our conversation with Rachel Kleinfeld, Senior Fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Now, coming up, we're going to pick up where Rachel left off and discuss more on the impact of the election cycle on corporate America. Johnny Taylor is joining us, CEO of the Society of Human Resources Management. That's next. This is Bloomberg Equality.
This is Bloomberg Equality. We're centering our attention on this election cycle through the lens of equality and what it means for corporate America. Now, recent analysis shows that executives are going quiet in this presidential race. Caroline.
And maybe that's where it should be, a return to the norm. Now, there's some really interesting data out from AlphaSense, just highlighting how many times in earnings statements we're seeing executives talk about election-specific issues. And it's dialing back down. Now, look, in 2020, more than 900 times on average was it being cited by executives in these earnings statements. But remember back to 2020, you had Mary Barra, we had the executives of Walmart calling out for a peaceful transition of power. We had, of course, the fallout post George Floyd. We had much to be said about the rights of individuals. But now we're going back to the norm, and we're just looking at the analysis of Alpha Sense 2024 about 300 times. Well, that's more akin to what we saw back in 2016, Romaine. So it does feel as though corporate America, the executives, are going quieter.
It'll be interesting to see whether that sticks. Let's get some insights out of Johnny Taylor. He's the president and CEO of the Society for Human Resources Management, and he joins us right now. And Johnny, I want to start off with that chart that Caroline had up, and you saw the big spike in the engagement, I guess, if you will, by corporate executives on these political topics during 2020. And it's very obvious, in hindsight at least, that a lot of that came because there was a lot of pressure from customers as well as from employees within those organizations. Are we not seeing that same pressure this election cycle?
No, actually, you're seeing the opposite. It's interesting when we reflect back on the 2020 race. Everyone, frankly, felt the pressure. When I say everyone, corporate executives, CEOs in particular, felt pressure to speak on every issue, right? If you recall, between COVID and whether you mask, whether you return to the office, George Floyd, Asian hate, there was so much going on in 2020, and employees were demanding, essentially, that their leaders speak up, speak out on issues that, frankly, oftentimes had nothing to do with their business. Well, there was one guy back in 2020 who was the CEO of, I think it was Coinbase, one CEO who made the headlines when he said, no politics at work. I'm not going to allow you to talk about it. If it doesn't have to do with work, don't talk about it. And all of the headlines described, oh gosh, a third, as many as a half of his employees quit because he dared to suggest that we not do that. Well, guess what? We're now all saying maybe he was smarter than the rest of them, because what happened is by the CEO taking a position and allowing people to discuss these things at work, we got away from work.
Right.
It affected retention, engagement, people's overall happiness at work was impacted because we went into a place that perhaps we shouldn't have in hindsight.
I remember that, Johnny, because my husband is a senior manager and an executive over at Coinbase, and I'm interested from your perspective as to whether now we see more companies doing similar, more executives, and indeed more employees coming in saying, I don't want to show up as my political self, I just want to show up as my employee self, or is it swinging the other way?
No, that part. More and more employees are saying, like, I'm exhausted. I come to work not to continue the fight. Like, I dropped off the kid in the morning, fought with them, I fought with the spouse, et cetera. And then I have to come here and be bombarded with, what do you think about the politics? What do you think about what the Supreme Court did? What do you think about this, that? So employees are resoundingly telling us, we don't want you to have blanket policies that say we can't talk about anything at work, but we'd prefer you just bring the temperature down. Just bring it down. And the other thing that we're hearing, which is really fascinating, is more and more there's been an outcry for civility in the workplace. In fact, we started a big campaign, 1 million civil conversations, because on one hand, we've been telling people it's okay to be your authentic self at work. Well, unfortunately, some people's authentic self is not appropriate for work, and frankly, arguably not appropriate for any place. And so we said, bring the temperature down. Employees are saying, I just want to come here to work, and sure, we can talk about a few things, but when it becomes ugly,
I am curious, though, Johnny, when we talk about how human resources managers have to deal with these issues, we'd be remiss in not pointing out that a lot of the efforts that companies across the board have made for inclusion and diversity in their workplaces, whether it's explicit or just implicit, that some of those issues run directly into the center of our culture wars. And I am curious as to how they're going to square that circle. Even if there isn't the same pressure in 2020, I'm sure you know there are still people kind of picking apart these training programs, these inclusivity disclaimers and other things that these companies make. How are managers supposed to address those issues when at the same time they are maybe fundamental to their corporate ethos?
Oh, they're incredibly fundamental. Our diversity is our strength. And what we've done is decided to have a different shift. There's been a pivot. The conversations are now focusing less on diversity, which by definition means difference. We focus so much on differences, now focusing on inclusion. So more and more, even at SHRM, we talk about inclusion and diversity. Not that you ignore diversity, because we need historically underrepresented groups to have opportunities, but the focus is on inclusion. I often say, as diverse as we've ever been, yet as divided as we've ever been. So what you're seeing human resources leaders and corporate leaders say is, yes, we want diversity, but we've got to ensure that everyone feels included. And that's tough, but it's the goal.
Johnny, we've got about 30 seconds. One piece of advice to bring down temperature if you're trying to manage this.
Demand civility, and there has to be serious consequences for employees who engage in incivility at work. It's not enough, though, just to demand it. We've got to show our employees how to be more civil, especially after tonight's debate.
Johnny Taylor, pushing us forward. We thank you, President and CEO of the Society for Human Resources Management, or SHRM, as you said it. Thank you so much for the piece of advice, and certainly a piece of advice that many are trying to take on board ahead of tonight's, well, toe-to-toe that we see with former President and sitting President Romaine. Still ahead, we've got our takeaways from the season of Bloomberg Equality. This is Bloomberg Equality. Look, the takeaways from this episode, from the season. I mean, civility, I thought that was such a good point ahead of tonight's toe-to-toe with the president.
It was a great way to end it. I mean, that was basically our last interview of this series. And I think so many of the issues that we're talking about, obviously there are some fundamental issues that need to be addressed in our society, but we know that the amplification of a lot of this is about the lack of civility. Everyone deciding, I'm right, you're wrong, and no one really wanting to see the differences in between. And we talked about this with Rachel Kleinfeld, who kind of said that the polarization we see in the society is probably a little bit more, I guess, not really the real picture as to what's really on the ground.
We don't hate each other,
We don't. Apparently, we all love each other.
We've actually all quite similar, but we're just not able to see those similarities. And look, there things are being amplified, whether it be in the world of social media or not. I feel like our first ever episode, all about the fact that, look, we're pulling back against DEI. Maybe that's not as proactive, not as all-encompassing as it seems when you dial into a conversation. It's actually just the chattering classes, and actually companies are still doing the work.
And it gets to this idea of nuance and middle ground, right? I mean, sometimes we swing the pendulum from one extreme to another, and we forget that for the majority of Americans, we're all just kind of looking for a comfortable middle ground where we can just, be happy and live, Caroline. That's all we really want.
And we made it global, too, the fact that we looked at what ultimately equality means around the rest of the world. And I thought it was interesting how we brought in other voting systems in other countries and how that is currently seeing, the right-wing trend that we see in Europe. But maybe that doesn't become all-encompassing to your politics. Yeah,
absolutely here. And we should point out, it's not just about the U.S. election. As you said, this is a global issue. And I think we've really reflected that in this series. And it's always a good way to sort of look at who we are, not just as a country here in America, but really as human beings across the world.
Oh, nicely put.
Absolutely.
I wish we could do this some more, but sadly it's our last one for this particular season.
Yeah, this is it for our month, this month's special Bloomberg Equality programming. We will be back next June with hopefully a whole new rundown of some of the issues going on out there in the world. Thanks for tuning in. This is Bloomberg.
We promise to be civil.